The stars in the Qatar Expanse were old and tired. They burned more dimly than most stars in the galaxy, and the space around them was quiet, so quiet that even experienced soldiers felt a nervous tension. It was a place where nothing was supposed to happen. No trade routes passed through it, and there were no colonies nearby. Great empires never deigned to give it their attention because there was nothing there worth having. This was exactly why Ambassador Valorn of the Terraki liked to use it as a patrol corridor. His ship, Eternal Thought, was a long, beautiful vessel. It was built with smooth, curved edges that sliced through the cosmos like a blade through water. Every surface was polished. Every system was precise. The Terraki had been building starships for 4,000 years, and it showed in every bolt and panel of Eternal Thought. In truth, it was the type of ship that made other species feel small and slightly embarrassed by their own technology. Valorn stood in the center of the bridge. He was tall, even by Terraki standards, with pale blue skin and 4 narrow eyes that moved independently of each other. He stared with 2 of those eyes at the long expanse of void beyond the main view screen, and he was bored. Patrols on the edge of the Qatar Expanse were never interesting. They hadn't been interesting for the last 12 rotations, and he had no reason to believe today would be any different. Then, his science officer, Mira-At, made a quiet sound. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the sound a person makes when they see something that doesn't match their expectations, and their brain is trying to catch up. A soft, short sound, like a word stuck halfway out of the mouth. Valorn turned one of his eyes toward her. "What is it?" Mira-At didn't answer right away. She leaned close to her console. Her fingers moved rapidly over the touch controls, running the same scan again. Her other 2 eyes remained fixed on the screen. "I'm getting readings," she said slowly. "But it doesn't make sense. Sensor glitch? No. I've checked 3 times. She straightened up and turned to him. All 4 of her eyes were directed at him, which meant she was serious. "There is a vessel." Valorn looked out at the view screen. There was nothing there, only stars. "Where?" 47 by 12. Approximately 9,000 cams. She paused. "It is very large." Valorn walked over to her console and looked at the data himself. He was silent for a long time. On the screen, the sensor readings showed him numbers and shapes that he kept expecting to see change because, surely, they were wrong. The vessel was 3.8 kilometers in length. While that in itself wasn't shocking, they built ships of that size. The Salvat Empire had ships even larger. The problem wasn't the size. The problem was everything else. "There is no quantum field around it," Valorn said. "Correct. No dark matter compression signature." "Correct. No anti-gravity stabilizers, no phase shielding, no energy grid of any type." He looked up at her. "How does it hold its structure at that size without any of those systems?" Mira-At looked at the screen and spoke the words very carefully, as if she didn't fully believe them herself. "According to the scan, the hull appears to be made of layers of metal. Thick layers. Very thick. And there are support beams running through the entire frame at equal intervals." She brought up a construction diagram on a secondary screen. It showed a cross-section of the mysterious vessel's hull. The layers were almost comically deep. The outer layer alone was roughly 40 meters of composite ferritic alloy. Valorn stared at the cross-section. "This isn't engineering. This is just piling metal on metal." "Yes, and beneath those layers, there appear to be pipes. Many pipes, carrying gas and liquid under pressure throughout the body of the ship." She hesitated. "The liquid appears to be water." Silence fell on the bridge. Several other crew members stopped working and were now listening to this conversation with the rapt attention that people give when they don't believe what they are hearing. "Water?" Valorn repeated. "Yes, sir." He straightened up and clasped his hands behind his back, which he did when he was trying to remain calm while his brain worked rapidly. "What is its drive signature?" Mira-At looked almost apologetic. "That is also unusual. I'm getting readings of several types of drives operating simultaneously. At the rear, there is a large thermonuclear torch drive, but there are also ion engines, chemical booster stages, and something generating a massive heat output in the core, possibly a fission-type reactor." "Fission." Valorn said the word as if it tasted strange. Fission reactors were what the Terraki had used roughly 3,000 years ago, before they discovered better methods. And the very idea that a species was still using fission as a primary energy source on a warship of that size was difficult to comprehend. "Is it armed?" Mira-At brought up the weapons analysis and looked at it in silence. Then she slowly read it aloud. "There are Apparently, large electromagnetic acceleration cannons on the dorsal and ventral surfaces. 24 of them, judging by the magnetic field signatures. They are enormous. She highlighted them on the diagram. Each one was nearly 3 kilometers in length. There are also closed compartments on the sides of the vessel, likely for missile storage, and a very large number of smaller point defense guns, covering almost all angles of the hull. Valorn looked at the diagram. The vessel, if it could be called that, looked like someone had taken every weapon available and bolted it to a very large chunk of metal, telling it to go somewhere. It lacked grace, it lacked fluidity, and it lacked a design philosophy that he could recognize or respect. It was blunt, heavy, and completely devoid of elegance. "Is it moving?" he asked. "Yes, slowly. It is accelerating in our direction. The thermal exhaust from the rear drive is significant. I am also detecting what looks like gas venting from several points along the hull. Possibly from internal pressure systems it is leaking. That is one interpretation." Valorn stood very still for several seconds. Then he made a decision. "Run the scan again. Full spectrum. I want to be absolutely certain of what we are seeing." The scan was run. The results came back. They were identical to the first 2 scans. The vessel was real. It was 3.8 kilometers of layered metal, pipes, and massive cannons. And it was slowly moving through the Qatar Expanse like something that had never been told it shouldn't be there. Then, the communication system on the bridge made a sound. A call signal. Simple, clear, and using a standard conclave frequency. Someone on that ship knew how to reach them. Valorn looked at his communications officer, who was staring at him with an expression of complete confusion. Valorn nodded almost imperceptibly. The channel opened. The voice that came through was human. It was relaxed. It was almost cheerful. It belonged to a woman, and she spoke in Galactic Common with an accent Valorn didn't immediately recognize. "Hello there," she said. "This is Captain Mara Oi, commander of the ship US Unyielding Principle, operating under the banner of the United Earth Sovereignty. We are on a routine patrol and picked up your vessel on our sensors about 20 minutes ago." A short pause. "Look, I'll be blunt. We aren't looking for trouble. In fact, we are looking for a navigational beacon. Ours failed during the last engagement, and we have been running on internal charts for about 6 days. If anyone there has a spare or could at least give us a positional ping, we would be very grateful. Captain OI." End of transmission. The channel closed. Absolute silence fell on the bridge of eternal thought. Valorn slowly turned to look at Miraat. She was staring at the comms panel with an expression he had never seen on her face before. He was quite sure it was on his face too, because he could feel it. A strange mixture of confusion, disbelief, and what? Something close to awe, which he didn't want to admit yet. A ship that shouldn't move was moving. A ship that shouldn't hold together was holding together. It had survived some collision. It had said so itself. It possessed sensors capable of detecting eternal thought, which was built to be nearly invisible to standard scanning, and it had hailed them on an open conclave frequency, casually asking for a navigational beacon. "Sir," Miraat said quietly, "what should we do?" Valorn looked at the view screen. Unyielding Principle was now visible. A dark, massive shape against the backdrop of the stars, moving with the slow, heavy confidence of something that had decided to go somewhere and wasn't particularly interested in what stood in its way. Venting gas swirled from its hull in thin, silvery ribbons. The thermal radiation from its engines made it look almost like a breathing creature. It was, without a doubt, the ugliest ship he had ever seen. And, he was starting to suspect, one of the most dangerous. "Connect me via a secure channel to the Conclave High Command," he said. His voice was steady. He was a professional. Priority 1. "I need to speak directly to the Admiral." He paused, watching Unyielding Principle get slightly larger on the screen, approaching through the darkness. "And someone, send those people a positional ping," they had asked politely. Miraat looked at him for a moment, then nodded and began working at her console. Around the bridge, the other crew members exchanged glances, quiet glances that carried the same unspoken message. Something has changed today. They didn't know exactly what yet, but that feeling was there, clear and undeniable, like a vibration in the floor that occurs right before something very large arrives. The report that Valorn sent to the Conclave High Command was 17 pages long. It contained full sensor data, structural analysis, weapons assessment, and transcripts of the communication. At the very end, in a section he titled personal observation, he wrote 4 sentences that his superiors would later quote in meetings for years to come. I have patrolled the Qatar Expanse for 9 rotations. I have encountered ships of 22 known species. I have never seen anything like this ship. I do not believe our current models of physics fully explain how it exists. He sent the report, then stood at the view screen for a long time, watching Unyielding Principle move among the stars. It left a trail of heat and exhaust behind it. Its hull, under enhanced visual sensors, was pockmarked and patched in dozens of places. Marks from weapons, from impacts, from damage that had been repaired by hand and was visible because no one had bothered to make the repairs clean. They had just made sure it held. He thought this said something important. He wasn't sure what, but he intended to find out. Meanwhile, on the other side of the 9-kilometer gap, on the bridge of Unyielding Principle, Captain Mara Oi accepted the positional ping from the Tarakian vessel, marked it on her charts, leaned back in her command chair, and told the navigator to set a new course. She didn't think too much about the alien ship watching her. The time for diplomacy and talk would come later. Right now, she had a patrol to finish, a crew to feed, and a list of repairs that now numbered 43 items and was growing. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway, and went back to work. The stars of the Qatar Expanse burned quietly around both ships, and somewhere in the space between them, something had begun, something they couldn't name yet. But everyone felt the galaxy had just gotten its first good look at Unyielding Principle. It hadn't decided what it thought about what it saw yet, and that was about to change. Ambassador Valorne's report arrived at the Conclave High Command in the 3rd hour of the morning cycle, when most staff were either sleeping or sitting quietly at their posts, doing routine work. The duty officer who received it read the first 3 pages, stopped, reread them again, and then headed straight for the Admiral's private quarters and knocked on the door. Duty officers didn't do this lightly. Waking the Admiral in the 3rd hour was a decision that could end a career if the reason turned out to be insignificant. The duty officer knocked anyway. Admiral Senra, a salvit of advanced age and significant reputation, opened the door in her nightrobe with the expression of a person about to say something sharp and final. She looked at the duty officer's face, and the sharp words didn't leave her lips. Instead, she took the datapad from the officer's hand, read the first page, and simply said, "Gather, everyone." By the 4th hour, the main conference hall of the Conclave High Command was full. They gathered quickly. Admirals, ship architects, weapons theorists, physicists, and diplomatic advisors from 11 of the 17 species that made up the Galactic Conclave. Some were still adjusting their uniforms. Some clearly hadn't slept. All of them stared at the same sensor data from Eternal Thought, and all of them wore variations of the same face. The face of a person who is very good with numbers and is looking at numbers that shouldn't be there. Admiral Senra stood at the head of the long table. She had read the full report 3 times on the way to the room and still didn't feel comfortable. She was not a person who liked to feel uncomfortable. She had built her entire career on being the one who understood things when others were in confusion. "So, let's go through this systematically," she said. Her voice was calm. She was good at keeping her voice calm, even when her mind was moving fast. To start, structural analysis. Architect Divini, your assessment. Architect Divini of the Braid, who had designed 6 of the Conclave's most advanced warships and was widely considered the best living expert on starship design, stood. He was a small creature with large black eyes and 6 thin fingers on each hand, and he looked as though he hadn't slept and wasn't going to sleep anytime soon. "Hull design," he said, and paused. "I want to choose my words carefully. It is not complex. It does not use resonant layering. There are no quantum-linked alloys, no phase distribution coding. What it uses is simple physical thickness." He projected the cross-section diagram onto the main display. The image elicited several quiet sounds from all around the table, the alien equivalent of sharp intakes of breath. Here is the outermost layer of the hull, approximately 40 meters of standard composite ferritic alloy. Below that, alternating layers of ceramic heat-resistant material and what the scanning identifies as reinforced concrete. "Concrete," said Vice Admiral Terran of the Drovani, a large, gray-skinned creature known for his direct manner as in the reinforced mineral aggregate substance that primitives used to build ground structures. "Yes." "On a starship?" "Yes." "A starship 3.8 kilometers long?" "Yes." Davini looked around the table. I understand the reaction. I had the same one. But consider what this achieves. A vessel with such depth of physical layering, even using exclusively base materials, is extremely difficult to destroy. With conventional energy weapons, plasma spears, particle beams, even phase disruptors. These weapons are all designed with the assumption that the target vessel has a certain hull depth, because no reasonable designer wastes mass on unnecessary thickness when better materials exist. But if you simply ignore the concept of efficiency and put 40 meters of metal in the way, you create a problem for those weapons that they are not designed to solve. Davini sat down. The room remained quiet for a moment. Internal structure, Senra said. Pipes. Another analyst stood, a Taraki physicist named Oral, who studied propulsion systems. The ship has an internal network of pipes with pressurized water and steam throughout its frame. At first glance, this seems like purely primitive thermal regulation, and it is partly that. But the network also functions as a sort of hydraulic structural support system. The pressurized fluid flowing through the pipes helps distribute physical loads throughout the hull in a way that complements the support beams. She brought up her diagram. It is inelegant, it is inefficient, but it works. In stress test simulations, the hull of this vessel should withstand impacts that would crack plates of quantum-linked alloys of equivalent mass. Simply because the distribution of physical material is so deep and so redundant. How does it move? Asked another voice from the table. Oral nodded, already expecting the question. That is where it becomes truly interesting. The ship does not use a single drive system. It uses several working simultaneously. A large thermonuclear torch is the primary drive. Old technology, but reliable and extremely powerful at scale. It is supported by ion engines, chemical boosters, and what appears to be a gravity-assist maneuvering system utilizing the ship's mass distribution. She looked at her notes. No single part of its propulsion system is impressive. Together, they produce thrust that is significant, not fast, not elegant, but constant and very, very difficult to simply stop. Admiral Senra nodded slowly. Weapons. The room seemed to lean forward slightly. The Conclave weapons analyst named Pratt brought up the weapons assessment. The primary weapon is the electromagnetic acceleration cannons, 24 of them. They work by accelerating a metal projectile, a solid metal projectile without an energy component along a rail system using a magnetic field to a very high speed, and then launching it at the target. Pratt looked uncomfortable. The projectile itself is simple metal, dense, heavy, very fast. Drenuk, a salvet, leaned forward. And the problem with this is our shields, said Pratt. All standard Conclave ship shields are designed for deflecting energy weapons, phase barriers, plasma dissipation fields, resonant dampers. They are all built to handle beams and energy bursts and particle streams. A solid metal object moving at high speed is a fundamentally different physical problem. Our shields slow it down, yes, but they do not stop it the way they would stop a plasma spear. He projected a simulation onto the main screen. A standard Conclave frigate with full shields, a railgun projectile. The result looked uncomfortable. The mass and speed of these projectiles, combined with the inadequacy of our standard shielding against kinetic impact, means that Unyielding Principle carries weaponry that is disproportionately effective against our specific defensive systems. Silence returned to the room longer this time. Then Drenuk spoke. He was old, very old, even by Salvet standards. And the Salvets lived long. He had studied military history and weapons theory longer than most species at the table had possessed space travel. He sat at the far end of the table and hadn't spoken until now, and when he did, everyone listened. I want to draw the room's attention to a recovered combat recording, he said. His voice was slow and dry as paper. 3 weeks ago, in the Draven corridor, a group of sovereignty raiders encountered an unidentified vessel. Based on the size and profile recorded in this record, I believe that vessel was Unyielding Principle. He put the combat recording on the main screen. The footage was from a drone, a sovereignty sensor, and showed a long, dark, familiar shape in the center of the frame, surrounded by bright streaks of weapon fire. The ship takes 14 direct hits from Sovereignty Mark 7 plasma spears during this engagement, Drenuk said. Watch closely. They watched as the plasma spears struck Unyielding Principle one by one, in a sequence that, by any standard starship durability model, should have disabled or destroyed it. Instead, each hit slammed into the outer layers of the hull, scorching the metal and leaving burn craters. but the ship kept moving, kept firing. After the 14th hit, one of its railgun turrets, which had been disabled, physically rotated back into place. Someone had repaired it during the fight, and it fired. "Hey, now look at this part," Drennock said. On the screen, a sovereignty cruiser approached the flank of Unyielding Principle. The human ship, instead of maneuvering away, turned into it. Then it accelerated straight on the cruiser's course and rammed it. It collided with it. The sound that emerged from all sides of the table was a collective noise that had no good translation. The sound made by people who cannot believe what they are seeing, but are definitely seeing it. Unyielding Principle sustained damage from the collision. The sovereignty cruiser sustained significantly more. The cruiser fell apart. Unyielding Principle kept moving. Drennock let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said what he had been leading to since he first read the report. "We have spent thousands of years optimizing our ships. We remove everything unnecessary. We build for maximum efficiency. We treat mass as a problem to be solved and redundancy as waste. We do this very well." He slowly surveyed the table. "What we have built by doing all this is ships that work perfectly in the conditions we designed them for, and ships that sometimes break, and break badly, when reality doesn't cooperate." He pointed to the frozen image of Unyielding Principle on the screen. These people did not have the resources or technology for optimization, so they did not optimize. They built something thick, redundant, heavy, and full of backup systems and physical solutions for every problem they could foresee. They built a ship that does not work well. He paused, but it does not stop working. And between those two things is a very big difference. He leaned back in his chair. The room remained quiet. Admiral Senra looked at the image on the screen for a long time. Then she looked at the people around the table, the architects, theorists, analysts, and officers, and said what they had all slowly, reluctantly come to themselves. "We need to know more about these people." She rose from her chair, which meant the meeting was coming to an end. "I want a diplomatic team assembled and sent to this vessel within 48 hours. I want a full analysis of the crew's behavior. I want engineering teams to find out everything the humans will let them know about those engines and that entire construction. I want weapons analysts to simulate all possible collision scenarios involving this ship against our standard vessel types." She started moving toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "And I want someone to find out if there are more ships like this, because if the humans have built a fleet based on these principles, we need to understand exactly what that means." The meeting concluded. People began to disperse, talking quietly, sending messages. The sensor scan data from Eternal Thought spread through the systems of the Conclave High Command, and from there further out. And within hours, engineers and analysts on 17 worlds were looking at the same hull cross-section diagram of Unyielding Principle and expressing the same emotions Miraat had felt on the bridge of Eternal Thought. An expression that was hard to describe. It was the expression of a person who had understood something very well their whole life, and had just discovered that there was a completely different way of understanding that they had never considered, and that the other way actually worked. In his quarters, Drennock sat alone for a long time after the meeting. He looked at the combat footage again, and at the moment when Unyielding Principle turned into the sovereignty cruiser and accelerated, not away, but forward. He watched it again and thought about a word to name it. Eventually he decided that the word was not a weapon, not an engineering term, and not a tactical term. The word was something much older and more fundamental. The word was will, and he hadn't seen a warship display that quality so clearly in a very long time. "They built it alive," he wrote in a note at the bottom of his analytical document. It wasn't an official observation. It was just 4 words he didn't know how to expand into a full argument yet, but felt were very powerful. He saved the document, turned off the screen, and sat in the dark, thinking about a 4-kilometer ship that leaked water from its pipes, smelled of heat and metal, and refused, against all expectations and all laws of efficiency, to stop. A diplomatic shuttle from the Conclave docked with Unyielding Principle at the 13th hour, joining an external airlock on the port side of the ship, which, according to the diplomatic group's preliminary briefing, was one of 7 working airlocks available at the moment. 4 others were either sealed due to damage or, in one case, under repair and unsafe for use. The shuttle's docking clamp made contact and locked. There was a knock, then a deeper thud, and then a sound as if something were being hammered into place by hand from the other side, followed by a short silence, and then the airlock light turned green. Delegate Miraat of the Taraki, who had requested to be on this mission because she had the most direct experience interacting with the vessel, looked at the green light, then at the two diplomatic security officers beside her. Neither of them said anything. The light was green. They proceeded. The airlock opened, and the first thing that struck them was the smell. It wasn't a bad smell, per se. It was a thick smell, heavy with machine oil and heated metal, and something sharp and slightly bitter that none of them could immediately identify. The corridor beyond the airlock was narrow by Taraki standards, with walls covered in pipes of various sizes. Some pipes were painted in different colors. Some had labels with human lettering. Some had small handwritten notes on sticker bases that Miraat's translation system processed as, "Check pressure weekly. This works hot. Do not touch," and one that simply read, "Do not touch." The lighting was functional rather than comfortable, bright enough for work, placed at regular intervals along the ceiling. Miraat noticed that some ceiling panels were open, revealing more pipes and bundles of cables above them, and that in one section, two humans were inside the open ceiling, doing something with tools. Their legs hung down into the corridor while they worked. Neither of them stopped working as the delegation walked past. One of them yelled, "Watch your heads!" without looking to see who was coming. The second thing Miraat noticed was the sound. Eternal Thought was very quiet while moving. Its systems operated with minimal vibration, and the ship's hull had sound-dampening elements that made the interior peaceful. Unyielding Principle was not quiet. It was a constant presence of sound, a deep, steady hum from engines far below, the hissing and gurgling of pipes, the distant clanging of metal, and where did that metal come from? The hum of electrical systems, and periodically, from invisible directions, the sound of human voices. In conversation, the ship sounded as if it were alive and working hard, and it sounded like a thing that operated under significant exertion and was not bothered by that fact. Captain Mara Owai met them at the intersection where the docking corridor exited into one of the main internal passageways. She was shorter than Miraat expected. Humans were, on average, significantly smaller than Taraki, and she was dressed in a dark military uniform that had seen a lot. Near the cuff of her left sleeve was a spot of something dark that she either hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to remove. Her face was calm and open. She held one hand out to Miraat, palm slightly upward and fingers together, which Miraat recognized as a human greeting gesture. Miraat extended her hand. The captain gave a brief, firm handshake, then let go. A handshake. Miraat had read about it. Experiencing it was different than reading about it. There was something strangely direct about it. A conscious, physical acknowledgement of another person's presence. "Delegate Miraat," she said. "Welcome aboard Unyielding Principle. I appreciate you making the trip." She looked at the delegation with an easy comfort. "I thought you would want a tour before we sit down and talk. We've had a lot of curious aliens asking for one." She said this without pride and without apology, just as a fact. "We would be honored," said Miraat. The tour began. Over the next 2 hours, Delegate Miraat and her team moved through sections of Unyielding Principle that the captain described at different times as mostly functional in operation and, once, regarding a section of corridor where the entire wall was covered in metal patches of slightly different colors welded over old damage. "It's been through some things," she explained, without being asked, that every patch represented a breach that had been repaired, some from weapon hits, some from debris impacts, some from what she described with a slight smile as engineering experiments that didn't go as we planned. The patches weren't smooth. They didn't match the surrounding wall. They looked exactly like what they were. Repairs made by people who needed the wall to hold and didn't have the time to make it look good. And yet, they held. Miraat pressed her hand against one of them as she walked past and felt its sturdiness. Metal fused with metal, ugly and strong. The engine room was the first place that truly stopped Miraat. It was enormous. It occupied several decks in the lower rear part of the ship, and it was full of machines that were large, loud, and radiated heat, in quantities that triggered a quiet alarm on her environmental sensors. Through a reinforced porthole to which Captain Owai led them, they could see the main assembly block of the thermonuclear torch, a series of massive magnetic containment rings surrounding a core that glowed white-yellow with such intensity that the porthole automatically dimmed to compensate. Human crew members moved about the engine room below in small groups, checking displays, adjusting controls, carrying parts from one place to another. They wore light protective suits and worked with the easy confidence of people who were perfectly comfortable in a room that, by any measure, was extremely dangerous. "How do they tolerate the heat?" asked one of the diplomatic security officers. "They train for it," said Captain O.I., looking through the porthole. "And they complain about it constantly, but they train for it." As if to confirm this, one of the men below looked up and noticed the delegation at the porthole. He gave a short wave. O.I. waved back. Then the man turned to a colleague, said something, and they both laughed at something that no one at the porthole could hear through the glass. From the engine room, they went to the reactor level, where the ship's fission reactor hummed in its protected housing in the center of a large chamber. A team of 4 was conducting what their instruments identified as a manual inspection, physically walking around the outer housing, checking sensors, tapping pipes, writing observations on actual paper forms attached to boards they held in their hands. "Paper," said Mirat's colleague, a technical analyst named Sepp, in a tone of complete disbelief. "Electronic systems can fail," said the chief engineer, who had joined the tour at this level. His name was Thomas Reyes. He was broad-shouldered, with hands rough and scarred from years of physical work, and he had a manner of standing that suggested he was most comfortable when something needed fixing. "Paper doesn't care if the electricity goes out. If the reactor's emergency cooling alarm goes off, I want my team reading from a checklist they can hold, not from a screen that might have lost power because of whatever triggered the alarm." He shrugged. "Besides, some of us just like paper." Mirat looked at the team moving around the reactor housing and thought about the logic of it. It was, in its own way, absolutely reasonable. Next were the weapons bays. The railguns were located along the entire length of the ship in large reinforced channels, and the guns themselves were the largest individual weapons Mirat had ever seen up close. Standing next to a railgun barrel was like standing next to a building. The magnets accelerating the projectiles were wrapped in copper coils that had clearly been rewound by hand. In one place, she could see where the original machine winding ended and the human rewinding began. A little less perfect, but functionally identical. Ammunition was stored in rooms the size of small warehouses, stacked in rows. The projectiles themselves were simple, dense metal rods of uniform size, each one the length of an adult Taraki, stored in racks with serial numbers painted on by hand. People moved between the racks on small vehicles, loading projectiles into the feed systems. There was practically no automation. It was physical work done by people. "How many shots per minute can they produce?" asked September. "Depends on the crew," said O.I. "Our best teams can produce 4 shots per minute from the big guns. We hit 5 times in live fire exercises, but that can't be sustained for a long time." She glanced at the loading teams. 24, thought Mirat. 24 guns the size of buildings, each capable of firing a dense metal rod so fast that it could punch through standard conclave shields. She thought about Davini's weapons simulation from the High Command meeting and felt something quietly shift in her assessment of this vessel. Then they went to damage control. Mirat found what she decided to consider the most important room on the ship. It wasn't glamorous. It was a large room with displays showing the structural status of every section of Unyielding Principle, color-coded by status. Green, normal. Yellow, damaged but stable. Red, immediate problem. At the moment, there were 11 yellow sections on the displays, and 2 reds. "What are those 2 red sections?" asked Mirat. "Deck 7, Section 12. We took a hit 3 weeks ago, and structural support in that section is degraded. The teams are working on it. We should be back to yellow by tomorrow." O.I. pointed to the second red indicator. "Deck 14, Section 3. A water pipe broke and flooded the compartment. We've contained it, but we're still draining it." "A water pipe broke?" "Yes," said O.I., completely without embarrassment. "It's already fixed. We're just dealing with the water." Mirat looked at the board and at the people working behind it and thought about the concept of damage control as a constant, active, continuous function of the ship, not as a reaction to a crisis, but just as a constant background process, as routine as navigation. This, she began to understand, was the key to everything. Unyielding Principle was not a ship that avoided damage. It was a ship that was built to sustain damage, immediately identify it, and fix it while continuing to fight. Hull thickness bought time. Redundant systems ensured that the loss of one thing didn't mean the loss of function, and the humans, their presence everywhere, their willingness to go into hot rooms, crawl through ceilings, and do things by hand. They were a living version of the same principle: redundant, persistent, hard to stop. After the tour, the diplomatic meeting took place in a room the captain called the officers' lounge. There was a long table and chairs constructed for human proportions. The delegation sat in theirs with varying degrees of comfort. Someone placed cups of a hot, dark liquid called coffee in front of each alien visitor, along with the information that they weren't obligated to drink it. Miraat took a sip. It was very bitter and very strong, and she found she liked it. Chief Engineer Thomas Reyes was present at the meeting, along with the ship's tactical officer, a tall, quiet woman named Lieutenant Commander Park, and several others. The conversation concerned diplomatic topics, official introductions, the exchange of patrol boundaries, information about the collision in the Draven corridor. But Miraat kept steering the conversation back to the ship itself, because she had been tasked with learning whatever she could, and because she was genuinely intrigued. At one point, she asked the engineer directly. She had been building toward this since the engine room. "When I want to ask you something," she said, "I'll try to phrase it so as not to offend." She paused. "According to our models of physics and engineering, this ship shouldn't function. Not at this size, not with this structural approach, not with these propulsion systems. Every analysis we've conducted says that something in its design should cause problems so severe as to prevent its operation." She looked at Reyes. "And yet it operates every day, apparently with you and your crew inside doing things by hand and fixing what breaks and keeping it running. How do you explain this gap between what we think should be true and what is actually happening?" Reyes looked at her for a moment. He had large, calm eyes and a manner of pausing before answering that suggested he gave questions serious consideration. "You said it should cause problems so severe as to prevent its operation," he said. "Yes, but it does constantly cause problems. Many problems." He gestured toward the damage control center. "Today, 2 red sectors on the board. Yesterday there were 4. Last week, railgun number 2 lost power for 6 hours due to a blown relay." He leaned forward slightly. "The difference isn't that our ship doesn't have problems. The difference is that we solve the problems every time as quickly as we can with everything we have." He leaned back again. "You're looking for a design secret? There isn't one. The secret is that we don't stop." Miraat looked at him. Then she wrote those words in her notes exactly as he had spoken them. "The secret is that we don't stop." The meeting came to an end. Courtesies were exchanged, and the diplomatic team headed back to the docking airlock. Passing by the open section of ceiling not far from the entrance corridor, the 2 humans were still there, still working. Tools clicked quietly against the metal above them. One of them yelled again as the delegation passed by their heads. Miraat automatically ducked, then smiled her species equivalent, at least, and went on. Behind her, Unyielding Principle hummed, worked, and exhaled heat and noise into the darkness of the Qatar Expanse. Alive, stubborn, deeply, forever alive. She had much to write in her report that evening. She wasn't sure where to start. The alert came in the 2nd hour of the sleep cycle, which meant half of Unyielding Principle's crew was in their bunks when the ship's systems began to scream. Captain Mara Owai was not in the sleeping half. She was on her feet from the 1st hour, sitting in the command chair with a cold cup of coffee and reviewing a maintenance report she had been about to read for 3 days. When the alarm sounded, she was already sitting straight. Her hand moved toward the comms panel before the sound had fully registered. "Report," she said. The voice of the night tactical officer returned quickly. "Sovereignty fleet approaching through the Ufter Portal, Captain. Multiple contacts still resolving. Sensors are being jammed, but I'm getting at least 9. Possibly more." Pause. "They are moving fast. Attack formation." OI was already on her feet. "General quarters. All crew to stations. Get a full count as soon as you can and wake the XO." She was already moving toward the main bridge when the alarm, now a continuous sound throughout the ship, a deep, repeating tone that every crew member knew meant, "Stop whatever you are doing and report immediately to your battle station," blared. By the time she reached the bridge, the ship had already transformed around her. She could feel it in the vibration beneath her feet. Output power of the engines increased as the propulsion systems switched from patrol mode to combat mode. The sound of running footsteps was everywhere. Doors opening and closing, short, sharp words spoken to each other through the corridors. She reached the command chair and looked at the main tactical display. The Ufter Portal was a natural region of space where the gravitational fields of two nearby collapsing stars created a narrow navigational passage, the only safe path through a wide belt of unstable space that would otherwise take weeks to cross. 17 inhabited systems were on the other side. If you held the portal, you controlled access to those systems. If you lost it, the enemy could pour through in any number. The main Conclave fleet was 14 hours away. It had been pulled to the far side of the patrol zone by a false alarm, a classic sovereignty diversion maneuver that the Conclave had fallen for because the false alarm was very convincing. Unyielding Principle was the only Conclave ship at the portal. I looked at the display. The sovereignty contacts were now resolving as the jamming partially dissipated. The enemy was moving fast and not particularly hiding, which meant they were confident. The count came in from the tactical officer in a steady voice that displayed professional training and nothing more. 11 confirmed contacts. Captain, 3 Dominion-class heavy cruisers, 5 Sword-class high-speed strike ships, 2 support carriers, 1 flagship identified as the Sovereignty flagship Iron Covenant. The tactical officer paused. Iron Covenant, 2-to-1 to Metro. Standard Sovereignty configuration. Main battle formation. 11 ships. One of them a flagship. Unyielding Principle was alone. I looked at the display for a long time. The calculation was simple, and the answer was clear. Unyielding Principle wasn't fast enough to run, even if she wanted to. The portal was behind them. Retreating would mean letting the Sovereignty pour through the portal unopposed for 14 hours until the Conclave fleet arrived. And 14 hours was enough time to take a position that would cost very expensive blood to take back. She opened a comms channel to the Conclave High Command. The response came personally from Admiral Senra, which told OI they already knew what was happening. Captain OI, we are aware of the situation, and our fleet is moving as fast as possible, but we estimate 14 hours until arrival. I understand, Admiral. OI maintained a steady tone. We will hold the portal. Send whom you can, when you can. She paused. OI, end of transmission. She closed the channel before the Admiral could respond. It was technically a breach of protocol. She did it anyway. She turned to her bridge crew. All of them were at their stations. All of them had heard the exchange. All of them were looking at her. You all know what we're doing, she said. Not a question. A statement. General quarters, full power to the railguns, open all missile bays, damage control teams, to your stations, and someone. Give me a firing solution on that flagship. Unyielding Principle turned to face the Sovereignty fleet. The first exchange happened at long range, which was unusual for a battle involving Unyielding Principle. The Sovereignty Sword-class strike ships closed in quickly, firing their plasma spears in coordinated bursts. Standard Sovereignty tactics. High-speed flanking maneuvers designed to weaken the ship's shields and reduce reaction time before the heavier cruisers closed in. The plasma spears hit. I felt the impacts through the ship, not the soft vibration of distant explosions, but the real physical shock of energy weapons hitting the hull at close range. The outer layers of the hull absorbed the impacts, converting the energy into heat and dissipating it through the layered composite structure. The damage screens showed the outer layer had sustained significant damage in 3 sections. Beneath it, the secondary layers held. Return fire. All railguns, said Lieutenant Commander Park from the tactical station. Unyielding Principle fired. 24 railguns, each the size of a building, fired sequentially, not simultaneously, which would have overloaded the magnetic systems, but in a cascading mode that the Park team had practiced hundreds of hours until they could perform it on autopilot. The sound inside the ship was deafening. A series of deep, resonating thuds that traveled through the hull and were felt in the chest and stomach of everyone on board. The metal projectiles crossed the distance to the Sovereignty strike ships in seconds. The shields of the Sword-class ships withstood the first 3 hits. They were designed for energy weapons. But a kinetic projectile isn't an energy weapon. But the shields withstood it enough for the hull behind them to handle the rest of the impact. The 4th and 5th hits were different. The shields were already working harder from the first 3 hits. And by the 6th and 7th, 2 Sword-class ships had hull breaches that their own damage control systems struggled to manage. The 8th projectile hit the front of one of the Sword-class ships with full force. The ship didn't explode spectacularly. It just fell apart. The front section separated from the rest of the hull and tumbled off into space, while the rear section spun out of control, venting atmosphere. 1 Sword-class ship destroyed, said Park. 2 damaged. They are adjusting their approach. They were. The Sovereignty fleet had expected this to be quick. A lonely ship, even a large one, against 11 ships with a flagship for support, shouldn't have been capable of dealing them damage in the first exchange. They pulled back slightly and regrouped. I saw on the tactical display the heavy cruisers moving forward. "Now they are bringing the cruisers," said Park. "I know. Missile bays 1 through 8. Fire on the lead cruiser. Full spread." The missiles launched from Unyielding Principle's side bays in a tight cluster. Not the uncontrolled smart missiles that Conclave ships preferred, but large, fast, physically heavy missiles with conventional warheads launched in such quantity that even a significant interception wouldn't stop all of them. The Sovereignty's point defense systems lit up, tracking and destroying missiles in quick succession. But the math wasn't on their side. 9 missiles broke through. 9 explosions rolled along the length of the lead cruiser's hull, and the cruiser fell off course, damaged and retreating. That was when Iron Covenant entered the fight. The Sovereignty flagship's weaponry was in a different category than the strike ships. The plasma spears it carried were long-range, high-intensity systems designed to penetrate heavy shields at long range. It wasn't built for fighting a ship like Unyielding Principle. That was because no one in the Sovereignty had ever considered the possibility that it might be necessary to fight a ship like Unyielding Principle. But it was very large and very powerful. And when it opened fire, the hits that reached the Unyielding Principle's hull weren't impacts the outer layers could fully absorb. The first hit from Iron Covenant went through 3 outer layers and struck the ceramic composite section. The explosion inside the hull knocked out 2 compartments on Deck 11. The second hit 30 seconds later came in the same area. The Sovereignty fire control system was good and had identified the weakened section. This hit penetrated deeper. "Breach on Deck 11, Section 46, called the Damage Control Officer. Sealing is automatic. Damage control teams, respond. Hull integrity is holding at 78% overall. Section 11, 46 is at 40%. Send teams there." The damage control teams were already moving, 4 of them in heavy suits, entering Deck 11 from adjacent sections with welding equipment and structural support materials. They worked in the dark. Electricity in that section had gone out from the hit, using handheld lanterns and memorized diagrams. They worked on the hull from the inside while the battle continued around them. The ship shuddered from hits above and below. The sounds of the railguns firing created a rhythm around which they learned to work. The battle continued for 9 hours. It wasn't a glorious battle in the traditional sense. There was no elegant maneuvering, no brilliant tactical turn that changed everything in an instant. Unyielding Principle couldn't outrun the Sovereignty ships or outmaneuver them. What it could do was absorb hits and return fire and keep doing it long after any calculation showed it should have stopped. OI fought the ship as Reyes had described to Miraat. She didn't stop, she adapted. When the Sovereignty strike, ships tried to concentrate fire on the damaged section of Deck 11. She rotated the ship so that a less damaged section turned toward them, exposing Iron Covenant to a direct broadside from 12 of her railguns. When 2 of those railguns were disabled by a direct hit, the teams in the weapons bays brought them back online within 40 minutes, physically replacing the burnt-out magnetic coil sections with spares they kept in every weapons bay. When the Sovereignty sent boarding craft small, fast ships designed to attach to the target hull and cut through Unyielding Principle responded with something that wasn't in any tactical manual because no one else could do it. The pipes running through the hull carried pressurized steam. In the sections where the boarding craft attached and cut in, Chief Engineer Reyes deliberately released this pressure into the breaches, and the boarding parties that made it through found themselves in corridors filled with superheated steam for which their suits were not designed. The Sovereignty had never needed boarding suits designed for steam because no one else had steam pipes on their warships. There were 3 boarding attempts. None were successful. 2 boarding groups retreated with heavy casualties. 1 team never returned. At the 6th hour, Unyielding Principle's railgun battery number 3 was disabled by a hit that destroyed its fire control systems. The team in that bay spent 22 minutes completely bypassing the damage control system and connecting the battery to a manual fire control board, a physical panel that one of the loaders operated by hand, counting the timing of the shots out loud. It was slow. It worked. At the 7th hour, the main drive failed. For 4 minutes, Unyielding Principle sat dead in space, continuing to take hits, unable to move. Its massive hull sat in the middle of the battle while the Sovereignty ships tried to close in, and finish it off. OI kept her voice steady on the ship channel, calling damage control and keeping the crew focused in the engine room. So Reyes and his team worked on the drive with the concentrated urgency of people who knew exactly how little time they had. The drive returned. Reyes later described the repair in a technical report as, "We identified the point of failure, bypassed the main control path, connected the backup system. And when that didn't work immediately, we hit the junction block with a wrench, and it started working." The technical report was later archived by Conclave engineers, who read it 3 times. Looking for the part that was a joke, it wasn't a joke. At the 8th hour, Unyielding Principle had lost 2 full decks to vacuum, had 17 yellow sections and 5 red sections on the damage board, and had its missile bays at 20% capacity. It had destroyed 2 Sovereignty strike ships, disabled a 3rd, heavily damaged Iron Covenant, and put 2 Sovereignty support carriers out of effective reach. The Sovereignty fleet still outnumbered it, but the numbers on the Sovereignty's side weren't the same numbers as at the start of the battle, and they had learned something in 8 hours that their commanders hadn't expected to learn. This ship didn't behave the way a ship should behave when sustaining so much damage. It should have slowed down, decreased firing rate, shown signs of crew degradation, slower reaction, less coordinated fire, increased errors. Instead, it kept firing at the same rate. The crews in the bays were still performing their loading calculations. The damage control teams were still working in the red sections. The captain's voice over the comms remained steady and clear. The Sovereignty fleet had inflicted immense damage on Unyielding Principle. They had not broken it. At the 9th hour, the Conclave Reserve Fleet arrived, and the Sovereignty, already heavily damaged, saw the approaching fleet on their sensors and began to retreat through the Ufter Portal. The retreat was fast and organized. The Sovereignty knew when the engagement had turned. Iron Covenant, its hull pockmarked and venting steam from multiple railgun hits, led the withdrawal. When the last Sovereignty ships vanished back through the portal, the Conclave Reserve Fleet entered the battle space and sent a call signal. The response from Unyielding Principle was immediate. "Conclave Fleet, this is Captain OI of Unyielding Principle. The portal is clear. Sovereignty forces have retreated." Short pause. "We wouldn't mind help with patching the hull on decks 7, 11, and 14, and we are low on railgun ammunition. If anyone has compatible rods, we'll handle the calibration adjustments." Another pause. "Anyway, good to see you." The Conclave-led ship, a Taraki heavy cruiser named Resonant Dawn, took position for a moment while its bridge crew looked at Unyielding Principle on their visual sensors. The human ship was listing 22 degrees to the left. It was venting atmosphere from 3 points along its hull. One of its railgun turrets was stuck at an angle, unable to rotate. Burn marks from plasma spear hits ran along its entire left side like burn scars. Parts of Sovereignty boarding craft were still attached to its hull in 2 places. It was still broadcasting all standard navigation lights. Its engines were running at normal power. Its remaining railgun turrets were tracking and moving, watching the portal in case something came back. The communications officer of Resonant Dawn looked at all of this for a moment, then opened a channel and said the only thing that seemed appropriate. "Captain OI, the portal is secured. You may retreat." From the bridge of Unyielding Principle, Mara OI looked at her crew, at the faces around her, tired and focused on the damage displays, showing how much the ship had endured at the tactical board, now showing only clear space ahead, and she let out a breath she had been holding for 9 hours. "Retreat," she said. "Someone make coffee. Lots of it." Unyielding Principle took position at the portal, listing slightly, softly venting steam. It looked like it had been through a lot, and it had decided that that was okay. It held. It always held. 3 weeks after the Battle of Ufter Portal, the Galactic Conclave held a session in its main hall that was later described by historians as the most significant gathering in 300 years. The hall was a large round room built to accommodate representatives of all 17 member species, with raised seats that curved around the central space in a wide arc. The ceiling was high and lit by a soft light that changed color slowly throughout the day cycle. It was a room designed to feel important, because the decisions made in it were usually important. Every seat was occupied. Admiral Senra sat in the high military command section, watching the representatives walk in and take their seats. She had attended hundreds of conclave sessions over her long career. She had never seen such energy in the room, a sort of focused, collective tension, like a group of people who all shared a question and were waiting for someone to answer it out loud. In the center of the floor stood Drenuk of the Salvets, hands clasped in front of him. He was the oldest creature in the room, and his presence there was itself unusual. Drenuk rarely spoke at full conclave sessions. He preferred his research rooms and his documents and his quiet conversations with people he had carefully chosen. But he had requested this session, and the Speakers' Council had granted it. And here he was. He waited until the room was completely silent. Then he began. "I will not summarize what happened at the Ufter Portal," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but the hall was designed for hearing, and every word reached every seat clearly. "You have all read the reports. You know what one human ship did against 11 sovereignty ships over 9 hours without support? I will not repeat the numbers. The numbers speak for themselves." He paused. Around the room, representatives of the 17 species fell silent. Even the Drovani, who were famous for their restlessness at meetings, sat quietly. "I want to talk about what we didn't understand before the portal and what we understand now, because I believe we made a mistake," said Drenuk. "Not a small mistake, but a large and fundamental one. And I believe we have been making it for a very long time without knowing it." He walked slowly to the display in the center of the hall floor and brought up the diagram everyone in the room had seen before. The cross-section of Unyielding Principle's hull. 40 meters of layered metal, ceramic, and concrete. The diagram that made engineers nervous, physicists skeptical, and weapons analysts quietly anxious. "When we first saw this," he said, "most of our experts called it primitive, inefficient, a waste of mass that could have been used for better systems, better engines, better weapons." He surveyed the room. "I admit, I was more careful with my words, but my initial intuition was the same. I looked at this and saw something that belonged to the past, a design philosophy that reasonable engineering had long since surpassed." He closed the diagram, opened a new display. This one showed sensor data from the Battle of Ufter Portal frame by frame. Unyielding Principle taking 14 consecutive hits from Iron Covenant, continuing to fire, its drive failing and returning within 4 minutes. Its crew repairing a railgun battery for manual operation in the middle of a fight. Steam venting through breaches to fight off boarding craft. The ship, after 9 hours, still broadcasting, still firing, still at the portal. "What this vessel demonstrated at the Ufter Portal was not primitive," said Drenuk. "It was what we forgot how to build. What we optimized away over 4,000 years of improvements." He turned to face the room completely. "We built ships that are faster, more precise, more powerful in a direct engagement, more efficient in every measurable aspect than this human ship. We are very proud of that. We should be proud. It is a real achievement." He let that sink in for a moment. "But we also built ships that work correctly. When everything goes according to plan, ships whose systems depend on other systems. And when one fails, the ones that depend on it fail too. Ships whose crews are trained for efficiency, not for the moment when efficiency is no longer available and you must solve problems with everything you have in your hands." He pointed to the display. "We built ships that are right, and then we encountered a ship that is not right, a ship that is heavy, loud, leaks, and is held together partially with concrete. And we watched as it held the Ufter Portal for 9 hours against an enemy that should have destroyed it in 1. The room was silent. Drenuk let it stay silent for a moment. "We did not lose the portal," he said. 17 systems did not fall under sovereignty occupation, not thanks to our elegant ships, not thanks to our precise systems, but thanks to the fact that 412 people on one very ugly ship refused to stop." He stepped away from the display. "I am not here to tell you that our design philosophy is wrong. It is not wrong. I am here to tell you that it is incomplete. We optimized for performance and removed everything that did not contribute to performance. And in doing so, we removed something we did not realize was a weapon. We removed stubbornness. We removed depth. But we removed the ability to sustain damage that would kill the system and replace that system with a human in a manual process and keep moving." He paused. "Unyielding Principle cannot beat our best ships in a clean, direct engagement, but it can outlast them. And outlasting, as the portal showed us, is sometimes the only thing that matters." He looked around the room for the last time. "I recommend that the conclave begin a formal study of human engineering principles with the goal of integrating elements of their approach into the next generation of our ship designs. Not replacing our methods, but complementing them, giving our ships, beneath the precision and elegance, a layer of something that doesn't require precision to keep working. He straightened up. I call it an irrational reserve. It is the part of the design that doesn't make sense on paper, but which keeps you alive when the paper has burned. He stepped back, watching as the session opened for response. Representatives spoke in turn. Some asked questions, some were skeptical, some were immediately convinced, some expressed concerns about cost and mass, and the difficulty of integrating such a different philosophy into existing design processes. The debate lasted for hours. That was how the conclave worked, and it worked well. And by the end of the session, an official commission had been created to study and implement Drenook's recommendation. It wasn't a perfect result. Nothing decided by 17 species at once could be perfect, but it was a beginning. The award ceremony for Unyielding Principle took place 6 days later aboard the conclave station Cat 7, a hall large enough to accommodate all conclave leadership along with representatives of every member species, and at the far end, the crew of Unyielding Principle. The ship itself couldn't dock with Cat 7. Its hull was still being repaired, and its docking profile didn't match the station's bays. It was moored outside, held by magnetic clamps attached to its port side by a station work crew that had spent 3 hours trying to attach the clamps to hull plates that were actively being welded in 2 places by Unyielding Principle's own engineers, who hadn't stopped repair work during the mooring and weren't going to. Inside the hall, 412 crew members stood in rows. All of them were in dress uniform, dark, clean, pressed to something close to sharpness. Although several crew members had the look of people who felt more comfortable in work clothes and were enduring the dress uniform with professional patience. At the front of the crew formation stood Captain Mara Oi, and she was the same height as always, shorter than most of the alien dignitaries around her. She stood with her hands at her sides and a straight back, watching the ceremony with an expression of calm attention. When Supreme Chancellor of the Conclave, Verse of the Salvets, stepped forward to present Unyielding Principle with the conclave's highest military honor, the Seal of the Common Star, awarded only 7 times in conclave history, she stepped forward. Oi accepted it with a handshake the Chancellor had rehearsed in advance, and held it for a moment before turning to show it to her crew. From the crew formation came a sound, not the strict silence of a military parade. A sound, a short, collective human sound of pride and recognition, which wasn't quite a cheer and not quite an ovation, but something in between. Something that went through the hall and touched the alien dignitaries in a way they found hard to explain afterward, but that they clearly felt in that moment. Then Oi turned back to the Chancellor and the microphone and stood before him. Admiral Senra, in the front row of the leadership section, watched the captain's face and wondered what she would say. She had heard acceptance speeches at such events before. Long, graceful, carefully prepared. She was prepared to hear something like that. What she heard was 11 words. 11 words, spoken in a voice that was clear and quiet, and didn't represent anything. It just spoke the truth. We just didn't think the word surrender was one of the options. Then Oi stepped back, and the ceremony continued. Senra looked at the captain for a moment. Then she looked at Drenook, who sat 2 seats to her right, and discovered he was already looking at her. They met eyes for a second. Why? And in that second, much was transmitted without words. Recognition that something had truly changed, that the galaxy was now different, in a small but permanent way, that the 11 words they had just heard would be repeated in meetings and in documents and in design bureaus for years. In the design bureaus, the changes were already beginning. At the Grand Wharf, which had built Eternal Thought and 100 similar ships, senior architect Davini had organized a new workspace. On the wall above his main design console, he had placed a printed image. Not a diagram, not a chart, just a visual sensor image taken by Resonant Dawn on arrival at the Ufter Portal at the end of the battle. The image showed Unyielding Principle from the side and slightly above, listed at 22 degrees, pockmarked, venting steam, with missing plating in 3 places. 1 turret frozen, 1 barrel dark and motionless, and the ship was enormous and damaged and clearly had been through something very bad. And the navigation lights were on. Everything. That detail had stuck with Davini since he first saw the image. The navigation lights. Every conclave ship, when sustaining that level of damage, rerouted energy from non-essential systems, including navigation lights, to critical systems. Navigation lights were decorative. They served no tactical purpose. No logical design philosophy would keep them on when a ship was fighting for survival. Unyielding Principle kept them on because any system controlling them continued to work regardless, and because no one told them to turn off, and because the people on board probably didn't even think about them because they were busy fixing what mattered. But the lights were on, and for Davini, looking at this image, they meant something. They meant the ship had never ceased being a ship, never ceased being whole, never accepted on any level of its construction that it was finished. He began calling his new design philosophy irrational reserve, after Drenuk's term. But in his private notes, he sometimes used another phrase, a phrase he didn't share with the committee or the commission, because it wasn't a technical term and he wasn't sure it belonged in a technical document. He called it the navigation light principle. Build something that keeps its lights on no matter what, regardless of what impacts it receives, regardless of how many systems fail around what powers the lights. Build it so deep and so redundant and so full of backup solutions and physical safeguards that people can fix when something breaks. Even when it should be dark, it isn't. It was inefficient. It would add mass, cost, and complexity. Several of his junior engineers had already raised these concerns at early design meetings, and he told them to write the concerns down, then put them aside. Unyielding Principle wasn't efficient. It was alive. He wanted to build ships that were alive. Unyielding Principle, as soon as its repairs were sufficient for deep space travel, was assigned a new patrol corridor. This assignment was a subject of discussion at the conclave level. Some representatives suggested keeping the ship near the conclave station as a symbol, a visible reminder of the Battle of Ufter Portal. OI, when asked about her preferences, simply said that a ship was a warship, and warships should be where they were needed, not where they looked good. The assignment was confirmed. New patrol corridor, combat duty. The crew returned aboard a week before departure. Returning from leave or from their own repair period of the ship, or from informal conversations with alien engineers that several of them had been involved in and that had lasted for days. Reyes returned with a Terrakian engineering textbook tucked under his arm. He had traded it for an Earth mechanical engineering textbook, which the engineer had accepted with visible enthusiasm. On the morning of departure, OI walked the ship from bow to stern. She did this before every deployment, and she wanted to see her ship, not the data from it, the ship itself. She walked through the corridors and checked the patches, ran her hand along the pipes, and looked at the damage control board in the damage control center, and looked at the weapons bays and the reactor level, and the engine room, and all the places where the crew lived and worked and kept Unyielding Principle moving through the darkness. The ship was never perfectly repaired. Something was always on the list. Some patch that wasn't quite smooth. Some system that was working at 90% instead of 100%. Some bundle of cables that needed replacing but was functioning adequately and would wait for the next port stop. The list was always 40 items long, sometimes 50. She looked at the list, then looked at her ship and felt a deep, familiar feeling. The hum and heat and noise, the smell of oil and metal, and the coffee from the galley 2 corridors away, the sound of boots on the deck as the crew moved to stations to prepare for departure. It was Unyielding Principle, ugly and loud, full of things that needed fixing and full of people who were fixing them. She went to the bridge. She sat in the command chair. She took her coffee. This time hot, someone had just brewed a fresh pot and she looked at the stars beyond the view screen. All departments ready, said the XO. Departing, said OI. Unyielding Principle engaged its engines, released the magnetic clamps, and moved away from the conclave station Cat 7 into the darkness. Its engines made the sound they always made, a heavy, prolonged rumble that was felt rather than heard. A sound the crew no longer noticed, but that made the station walls vibrate slightly as it passed by. On the station's observation deck, a small group of people of different species gathered to watch it go. Mirat was there, Davini was there, Drenuk, who had come to the station for the ceremony and had stayed longer than he had planned, was there. A dozen others, engineers, diplomats, analysts, officers who all had their own experience interacting with the ship or its crew and the idea of it. They watched as Unyielding Principle shrank against the backdrop of the stars. It was still listing slightly to the left, a minor residual trim problem from repairs that the crew would fix on the way. It left a faint thermal trail from its engines. One of its external antenna systems was rotating slightly unevenly, suggesting that a bearing wasn't quite right and would likely require attention at some point. Its navigation lights were on. Everything. small against the darkness, clear and steady, moving away into the Qatar Expanse with the slow, heavy confidence of something that had decided where it was going and wasn't bothered by distance. Drennick watched until the lights were so small he had to focus to find them against the backdrop of the stars. Then he stood quietly for a moment, then turned and headed back to his research rooms to continue the work he had been doing. He had a lot to write. He always had a lot to write. But for the first time in years, he was writing about something he didn't yet fully understand. And that feeling, the feeling of true mystery on the edge of true knowledge, was something he had almost forgotten. He found he was glad it had returned. Unyielding Principle moved on through the darkness. Its lights were on. They were always on.